Hello, everyone. Today we are going to listen to the story, The Tragic Tale of King Lear. This famous story was written by William Shakespeare around the year 1606. It is one of the most emotional and heartbreaking stories ever written, and today we will listen to it in very easy English for English learners. Long ago, in the beautiful country of England, there lived an old king named Lear. King Lear was very powerful, and many people respected him. He had ruled the kingdom for many years, and now he was becoming old and tired. His hair had turned white, and his body was weak. He no longer wanted the heavy responsibility of ruling the kingdom every day. He wanted to rest and live peacefully for the rest of his life.
King Lear had 3 daughters. Their names were Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia. Goneril was the oldest daughter. Regan was the second daughter, and Cordelia was the youngest. Lear loved all 3 daughters very much, but he especially loved Cordelia because she was kind, honest, and gentle. Even though he loved her most, he did not fully understand her quiet nature. One day, King Lear called all the important men of the kingdom to his great hall. The room was full of rich clothes, shining gold, and serious faces. The king sat on his large throne while his daughters stood before him. Everyone waited silently because they knew the king was about to make an important decision.
King Lear slowly stood up and looked at his daughters. In a loud voice, he said that he had decided to divide his kingdom among his 3 daughters. He explained that he was old and wanted to rest from ruling. But before giving them their parts of the kingdom, he wanted each daughter to tell him how much she loved him. The old king smiled proudly because he believed this would be a beautiful moment. He wanted to hear sweet words that would make his heart happy. Many people in the hall watched carefully because they understood that the future of the kingdom depended on this moment.
First, Goneril stepped forward. She bowed before her father and spoke with a smooth and careful voice. She said she loved her father more than words could explain. She said her love for him was greater than freedom, wealth, beauty, or even life itself. She called him the most important person in the world. King Lear listened happily. His old face became warm with pride. He believed every word she said. He thanked her and promised her a large part of the kingdom. Then Regan stepped forward. She was just as clever as her older sister. She spoke even more dramatically than Goneril. Regan said that her sister's words were not strong enough because her own love for the king was much deeper. She claimed that nothing in life gave her happiness except her father's love. Again, King Lear smiled with great joy. He felt proud and satisfied. He gave Regan another large part of the kingdom. Finally, It was Cordelia's turn to speak. The youngest daughter stood quietly before her father. Unlike her sisters, she did not enjoy using false and dramatic words. She truly loved her father, but she believed honest love should be shown through actions, not empty speeches. King Lear looked at her and asked, "Now, my dear Cordelia, what can you say to show your love for me?"
Cordelia lowered her eyes for a moment and answered softly, "Nothing, my lord." The entire hall became silent. The king's face suddenly changed with shock and anger. He could not believe what he had heard. "Nothing?" Lear asked loudly. Cordelia calmly replied that she loved her father as a daughter should love a father. She said she loved him honestly, neither more nor less. She explained that if her sisters loved him completely, then why did they marry husbands? She said that when she married one day, part of her love and care would belong to her husband, too. These honest words made King Lear furious. He thought Cordelia did not love him. His pride was deeply hurt because he wanted beautiful praise, not simple truth. In his anger, he could no longer think clearly. One of the king's loyal friends, a nobleman named Kent, stepped forward. Kent loved the king faithfully and knew Cordelia was speaking honestly. He begged Lear to stay calm and not make a terrible mistake. Kent warned him that Goneril and Regan were not sincere. But Lear's anger only grew stronger. He shouted at Kent and accused him of disrespect. When Kent continued defending Cordelia, the king became even more furious. Finally, Lear banished Kent from the kingdom. Kent sadly left, knowing that danger was coming. Then Lear turned back to Cordelia. In front of everyone, he announced that she would receive nothing from him. He said she was no longer his daughter. The king divided the kingdom only between Goneril and Regan. Cordelia stood silently, with tears in her eyes, but she did not fight or beg. Deep inside, her heart was broken. She loved her father deeply, but he could not see the truth. At that moment, two men were present who wished to marry Cordelia. One was the Duke of Burgundy, and the other was the King of France. When Burgundy learned that Cordelia had lost her wealth, he no longer wanted to marry her. But the King of France saw her honesty and goodness. He admired her brave heart and pure character. The King of France said that Cordelia was more valuable without riches, because her honesty made her truly beautiful. He gladly married her and took her to France with him. Before leaving, Cordelia looked sadly at her sisters. She knew they were not honest women. Quietly, she asked them to take care of their father. Goneril and Regan smiled politely, but inside they felt annoyed by her words. Soon after this, King Lear gave away his power and began living with his daughters. He planned to spend time first with Goneril and later with Regan. Even though he was no longer king, he still expected to be treated with great honor. He traveled with 100 loyal knights who served him wherever he went.
At first, Goneril treated her father kindly, but after some time, her true nature began to appear. She became angry about the large number of knights living in her house. She thought the old king and his men were noisy and troublesome. Slowly, she began speaking to her father with coldness and disrespect. King Lear noticed the change, and it hurt him deeply. The daughter who once spoke such sweet words now treated him like a burden. One evening, Goneril finally spoke openly. She told her father that his knights were wild and disorderly. She demanded that he reduce the number of men serving him. Her voice was hard and cruel. Lear stared at her in disbelief. He could not understand how his loving daughter had changed so quickly. His heart filled with pain and confusion. For the first time, he began to feel the terrible consequences of his own mistake. King Lear could hardly believe what he was hearing. The same daughter who once called him the most important person in the world was now speaking to him with cold eyes and an impatient voice. His old heart felt heavy inside his chest. He tried to control his anger, but pain and sadness slowly filled his mind. He looked at Goneril and asked if she truly wished to shame her own father. But Goneril did not change her attitude. She said the king was old and needed to behave more wisely. She complained again about his knights and said her house had become loud and unpleasant because of them. Lear's hands trembled with emotion. He felt betrayed. Tears almost came into his eyes, but his pride stopped him from crying. Instead, he cursed Goneril in his anger and called her an ungrateful daughter. Then he decided to leave her house and go to Regan, believing his second daughter would treat him more kindly. As he traveled through the countryside with his loyal knights, the old king tried to comfort himself. He repeated many times that Regan loved him more than Goneril did. He believed Regan would welcome him warmly and protect his honor. But deep inside, fear had already started growing in his heart. At the same time, Kent secretly returned to help the king. Even though Lear had banished him, Kent still loved his master faithfully. He disguised himself by changing his clothes and appearance so nobody would recognize him. Using another name, he entered the king's service again because he wanted to protect Lear from danger.
When Kent met the king on the road, Lear did not recognize him. Still, he liked the honest and brave way the disguised Kent spoke, so he accepted him as a servant. Kent stayed close to the king, watching carefully as the situation became darker. Before Lear arrived at Regan's castle, Goneril secretly sent a message to her sister. In the letter, she warned Regan not to give the king too much freedom or respect. The two sisters had already begun working together against their father. When Lear finally reached Regan's home, he expected comfort and kindness. But something felt strange immediately. The servants were cold and unfriendly. Soon, Lear discovered that Regan and her husband had already received Goneril's message.
To make matters worse, Kent had argued with one of Goneril's rude servants before arriving at the castle. Because of this, Regan ordered Kent to be punished and locked in wooden stocks outside like a criminal. This was a terrible insult because Kent was serving the king himself. When Lear saw Kent sitting painfully in the stocks, he became shocked and furious. He demanded to know who had dared to punish his servant without permission. But Regan calmly answered that Kent deserved the punishment. The old king felt another sharp pain in his heart. His daughters no longer respected him as king, or even as father. Soon, Goneril herself arrived at the castle. Lear realized with horror that both sisters were now united against him. He looked desperately from one daughter to the other, hoping one of them would show love or pity. But neither face showed kindness. Regan then told Lear that he should reduce the number of his knights. Goneril agreed immediately. Together they argued that he did not need so many men following him. Lear became desperate. He asked if he could at least keep 50 knights. Regan refused. Then he asked for 25. Again, they refused. Finally, they told him he needed no knights at all. The old king stood there, shaking with grief and rage. He had once ruled the entire kingdom, but now his own daughters treated him like a useless old man. Everything he had proudly given away was now being used against him. Outside, dark clouds filled the sky. Strong winds began blowing across the land. The weather seemed to reflect the storm growing inside Lear's heart. Unable to bear the humiliation any longer, Lear rushed out into the night. The terrible storm had already begun. Rain poured heavily from the sky, while thunder shook the earth. But the king no longer cared about comfort or safety. His mind was breaking under pain and betrayal. Kent and a few loyal followers ran after him, trying to protect him from the violent weather. But Lear wandered across the open fields like a man lost between madness and sorrow. The storm became stronger and stronger. Thunder crashed loudly, while cold rain soaked the king's clothes. Lear lifted his face toward the dark sky and shouted wildly into the storm. He cried out against his daughters, against injustice, and against the cruelty of the world. The old king's mind slowly began slipping into madness. He spoke to the wind as if it could hear him.
He laughed strangely one moment and cried the next. Years of pride, anger, and poor decisions now returned to punish him. Beside him stayed the fool, a loyal servant who often entertained the king with songs and jokes. But the fool was more than just a joker. He often spoke wise truths hidden inside simple words. Throughout the storm, the fool tried to comfort Lear while gently reminding him of his mistakes. The fool sadly told Lear that he had been foolish to give away his power. He said the king had become weak by trusting false love instead of honest hearts. These words hurt Lear deeply because he slowly realized they were true. After wandering through the storm for many hours, Kent finally found a small, broken shelter where the king could rest. Inside the poor little building, Lear met a strange man who looked dirty, wild, and half crazy. The man called himself Poor Tom. In truth, this man was Edgar, the son of another nobleman named Gloucester. Edgar had been forced into hiding because his evil brother Edmund had betrayed him. Gloucester was a loyal nobleman who still cared about King Lear. He secretly helped the king, even though Regan and Goneril warned people not to support him. Gloucester pitied the old king's suffering and feared for his safety. But Gloucester himself had terrible problems inside his own family. Gloucester had 2 sons. One was Edgar, his honest and kind son. The other was Edmund, his younger, illegitimate son. Edmund secretly hated Edgar because Edgar would inherit their father's wealth and title. Edmund was clever, dishonest, and ambitious. He wanted power for himself, and he was willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way. Using lies and false letters, Edmund tricked Gloucester into believing that Edgar planned to betray him. Gloucester became frightened and angry. Poor Edgar was forced to escape for his life and hide in the countryside, disguised as the mad beggar called Poor Tom. Now during the storm, the broken King Lear sat beside the disguised Edgar without knowing who he really was. As Lear looked at the poor, dirty man, he suddenly began thinking deeply about human suffering. For perhaps the first time in his life, he understood how hard life was for poor people who had no homes, no warmth, and no protection from storms. The proud king who once lived in golden palaces now sat in darkness beside beggars and outcasts. His suffering was slowly changing him. Meanwhile, danger continued growing in the kingdom. Gloucester secretly learned that foreign forces from France had landed in England to help Cordelia rescue her father. Believing this was the only hope left for Lear, Gloucester decided to help the old king escape safely. But Edmund discovered his father's secret loyalty. Wanting more power for himself, Edmund betrayed Gloucester to Regan and her cruel husband, Cornwall. Edmund informed them that Gloucester was helping the king and supporting the French forces. When Regan and Cornwall heard this, they became filled with rage. Soon, Gloucester was captured and brought before them like a criminal. Gloucester was dragged into the room by armed servants, while Regan and Cornwall watched him with cruel satisfaction. The old nobleman was tired and frightened, but he still tried to stand with dignity. Cornwall demanded to know why Gloucester had helped King Lear and supported the French army. Gloucester answered bravely that Lear was still his king and deserved kindness, not cruelty. These words only made Cornwall angrier. Regan insulted Gloucester and called him a traitor. Then, in one of the darkest moments of the story, Cornwall punished Gloucester in a terrible way. The cruel man blinded him and threw him out helplessly. After this terrible act, even some servants became shocked by the cruelty they had witnessed. One servant tried to stop Cornwall, and during the fight, Cornwall was badly wounded. Later, Cornwall died from his injuries. But the damage had already been done. Gloucester was now blind and broken. The poor old man was led outside by a kind servant. Gloucester could no longer see the world around him. Darkness covered his eyes forever. As he walked slowly and painfully, he finally understood the truth about his sons. He realized Edgar had always been loyal, while Edmund had betrayed him completely. At the same time, Edgar secretly followed his father, while still dressed as poor Tom. His heart broke when he saw Gloucester suffering, but he did not reveal his true identity yet. Edgar feared the danger was still too great. Blind and hopeless, Gloucester felt his life had no meaning anymore. He believed he had lost everything. In deep sadness, he asked poor Tom to guide him to the high cliffs near Dover, because he wanted to end his own life. Edgar understood his father's pain, but he wanted to save him. So he carefully led Gloucester across the countryside while pretending to be the poor, mad beggar. Meanwhile, King Lear's mind continued falling deeper into madness. The betrayal from his daughters had wounded him more deeply than any sword could. Sometimes he spoke wisely about justice and human suffering, but moments later he would laugh strangely or speak to people who were not there. Yet, through all his pain, Lear slowly became a different man. Before, he had been proud and selfish. He cared too much about praise and power. But suffering was teaching him humility and compassion. Far away in France, Cordelia had learned about her father's terrible condition. Her heart filled with sorrow when she heard how cruelly her sisters had treated him. Even after Lear had rejected and disowned her, Cordelia still loved him deeply. Now she returned to England with the French army, not to seek revenge or power, but simply to rescue her father and bring peace
back to the kingdom. When Cordelia finally found Lear, the old king was weak, exhausted, and mentally broken. He slept for many hours while doctors and servants cared for him gently. At last, Lear slowly opened his eyes. Soft music played quietly nearby, and Cordelia stood beside him with tears in her eyes. The old king looked confused at first. He thought perhaps he was dead or dreaming. Cordelia gently held his hand and spoke kindly to him. Lear stared at her face in disbelief. Shame and sadness filled his heart as he remembered how cruelly he had treated his honest daughter. With a weak voice, Lear asked if she truly forgave him. Cordelia answered with love and tenderness. She told him there was nothing to forgive. At that moment, Lear finally understood the difference between true love and false words. The daughter who had spoken honestly was the only one who remained loyal. The reunion between father and daughter was emotional and peaceful. For a short time, it seemed possible that happiness might still return. But tragedy was still waiting ahead. Edmund had now become powerful after betraying both his father and brother. Goneril and Regan were also fighting over Edmund because both sisters desired him. Their jealousy and ambition created even more hatred and danger. Soon, war began between the French forces supporting Cordelia and the English forces led by Edmund. The battle ended badly for Lear and Cordelia. Their army was defeated, and both father and daughter were captured. Even after victory, Edmund remained cruel and ambitious. Secretly, he ordered that Cordelia should be killed in prison. He wanted her removed forever, so nobody could challenge his power. At the same time, Goneril and Regan's jealousy became deadly. Goneril poisoned Regan because she wanted Edmund for herself alone. But soon afterward, Goneril's crimes were discovered. Filled with despair and guilt, she ended her own life. Meanwhile, Edgar finally revealed himself and challenged Edmund to a fight. During the battle, Edgar defeated his evil brother. As Edmund lay dying, he finally admitted his crimes and confessed the terrible order he had given against Cordelia. Messengers rushed to save her, but they arrived too late. Cordelia had already been killed. Soon afterward, King Lear entered carrying Cordelia's lifeless body in his arms. The old king cried out in unbearable grief. His voice was filled with pain deeper than words could explain. Lear held Cordelia close and begged her to speak again. He looked at her lips, hoping to see even the smallest sign of life. But there was only silence. Everyone watching felt heartbroken. The once powerful king who had ruled a great kingdom now stood destroyed by his own mistakes and by the cruelty of the world around him.
Lear finally understood everything too late. He understood that love is not measured by beautiful speeches. True love is quiet, honest, and faithful. Cordelia had loved him truly from the beginning, but his pride had blinded him. As Lear continued holding his daughter, his broken heart could endure no more. The pain, guilt, sorrow, and exhaustion became too much for the old man. Slowly, King Lear died beside Cordelia. The kingdom was left filled with sadness after so much death and suffering. Many cruel and ambitious people had destroyed themselves through greed, lies, and betrayal. Only a few honest people remained alive to rebuild the broken land. Edgar survived after all his suffering, and many believed he would help guide the kingdom wisely. Kent also remained loyal until the very end, serving his king faithfully through every moment of pain and madness. The story of King Lear became famous because it shows how dangerous pride and blindness can be. Lear could not see the truth when honest love stood before him. He listened to sweet lies instead of sincere words, and his mistake destroyed nearly everyone around him. But the story also teaches something beautiful. Even in a world filled with cruelty, true love and loyalty still exist. Cordelia never stopped loving her father, even after he hurt her deeply. Her kindness remained pure until the end. And so the tragic story of King Lear reminds us that power, wealth, and praise are not the most important things in life. Honest love, wisdom, humility, and kindness are far more valuable. Thank you for listening to this story.